It's the year 1874 inside a small courtroom in Tennessee, and a woman named Martha Simmerman is sitting in front of a judge, and her entire life is about to be decided by one single question. Does she have African blood in her veins? That's it. That's the whole trial. Not what she did, not what she said, just what runs through her blood, because if the answer is yes, she loses everything. Her inheritance, her land, her name, her freedom to live as a white woman in the American South, and if the answer is no, she keeps it all. Now imagine sitting in that chair knowing your whole future is riding on your bloodline, and you don't even fully know the truth yourself. That's the panic Martha Simmerman felt, and she's not alone. For almost 200 years, an entire group of people in the mountains of Appalachia lived exactly like this, hiding, denying, and lying about who they really were, just to survive. They were called Melungeons. And until very recently, nobody, not historians, not scientists, not even the Melungeons themselves, knew where they actually came from. But in the last 15 years, DNA testing cracked this case wide open, and what it found is not what anyone expected. Not the Portuguese sailors, not the lost colonists, not the ancient Phoenicians, something else entirely, something that a lot of families spent generations trying to bury. Stick with me, because this story has courtrooms, secret bloodlines, a strange word that means cursed by God, and a scientific twist that rewrites what we thought we knew about race in early America. So let's go back further to the 1700s, when English settlers were pushing deeper into the mountains of what is now East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, and North Carolina. And when they got up into these remote hollows and ridges, they found something they did not expect. There were already people living there, not Native American tribes, not European colonists, a group of people with dark skin, straight hair, sharp European facial features, and they were speaking English, some of them mixed with a language nobody could quite place. They weren't builders of a nearby town. They didn't answer to any nearby colony. They already had cabins. They already had families. They already had generations behind them, and the settlers had no idea what to call them, so they didn't call them anything kind. Over time, the word that stuck was Melungeon. Nobody agrees exactly where that word came from, but one of the more chilling theories is that it comes from an Afro-Portuguese or Arabic phrase meaning something close to cursed soul or one abandoned by God. Think about that for a second. This wasn't a name they gave themselves with pride. It was a slur thrown at them by outsiders who didn't understand what they were looking at, and it stuck for centuries, following families around from county to county, from one generation to the next, like a label they could never fully wash off. Now here's where it gets even stranger. Nobody could explain how these people got there. There was no ship that landed, no wagon train on record, no official colony that matched. Well, they just were there, already settled, before most of the official European settlement of the region even began. So naturally, when you have a mystery like that, people fill in the blanks with legends. And the legends around the Melungeons are wild. Some claimed they were descendants of shipwrecked Portuguese sailors who washed up on the coast generations earlier and slowly made their way inland, intermarrying with native tribes along the way. Others insisted they were the lost remnants of the Roanoke colony, the English settlement that vanished without a trace in the late 1500s, the single most famous disappearance in American colonial history. Some historians even floated the idea that Ottoman Turks, enslaved by Spanish explorers and later freed or escaped, made their way into the Appalachian interior long before Northern Europeans arrived in force. Add to that theories involving Romani travelers, Jewish merchants fleeing persecution, and Moorish sailors, and you get one of the most tangled origin stories of any group in American history. Every generation added a new theory, a new twist, a new possibility, and by the time you reached the 20th century, there were probably a dozen competing legends floating around, each one passed down by a different family, each one believed with total sincerity. But here's the thing. None of these legends were random. Every single one of them served a purpose. And that purpose was survival. To understand why, you need to understand just how brutal racial law was in the American South during this period. By the early 1800s, being classified as colored or of African descent wasn't just a social label. It came with devastating legal consequences. You could lose the right to vote. You could lose the right to testify in court against a white person. You could lose your land. You could be barred from certain jobs, certain marriages, certain churches. In 1834, Tennessee actually rewrote its state constitution to strip free people of color of rights they had previously held. So, if you were a family with mixed ancestry living in the mountains and someone accused you, even just accused you of having African blood, your entire life could be dismantled in a courtroom. This is exactly what happened to Martha Simmerman in 1874, and it's exactly what happened to a man named Jacob Perkins back in 1855, who was so afraid of being publicly accused of having African ancestry that he wrote to his lawyer explaining just how disastrous that accusation could be. Being labeled that way meant you could be treated as inferior under the law, subject to punishment, subject to being whipped, subject to fines, subject to a complete collapse of your legal standing as a citizen. This was not some abstract insult. This was your whole world on the line, and everyone in these mountain communities knew it, which is exactly why the stakes of a single court case could feel like life or death. So when Martha Simmerman sat in that Tennessee courtroom in 1874 fighting for her inheritance, her lawyer, a man named Lewis Shepard, did something clever and desperate at the same time. He argued that her family wasn't of African descent at all. He argued they were descendants of ancient Phoenicians who had migrated to Portugal centuries earlier and then crossed the Atlantic to settle in the Carolinas. And it worked. She won. She kept her inheritance. Because in the racial hierarchy of the pre-Civil War and post-Civil War South, being called Portuguese or Spanish or Turkish or even Italian was survivable. Those groups were seen as exotic, maybe foreign, but still broadly acceptable within the boundaries of whiteness. Being labeled as having African ancestry was not survivable. It could cost you everything. So an entire community learned, generation after generation, to protect itself with a story. The Portuguese story, the lost colony story, the Turkish sailor story, whatever story worked in whatever courtroom, in whatever county, in whatever decade. These weren't just campfire legends passed down for fun. These were survival scripts, rehearsed and repeated because the alternative was ruin, and because one wrong answer in front of one hostile judge could end generations of hard-won stability in a single afternoon. And it worked for a long, long time. Generations of Melungeon families grew up believing their own family's version of the story. Grandmothers told grandchildren they were Portuguese. Fathers told sons they had Turkish blood or native blood. These weren't necessarily lies told with malicious intent. Many families had genuinely convinced themselves, because believing it was safer than questioning it, and because questioning it risked pulling a thread that could unravel their entire social standing. Children were raised on these stories the same way any family raises children on stories about where they came from, with total sincerity, total pride, and zero doubt. By the time you get to the 20th century, there were tens of thousands of people scattered across Appalachia and beyond who identified, at least in part, as having Melungeon heritage, and almost all of them held onto some version of the exotic Mediterranean origin story, passing it down as gospel truth, without ever questioning where it actually came from, or why it had been so important to their great-great-grandparents in the first place. Then science entered the picture, and things got complicated fast. In the late 1960s, a blood sample study was conducted on a group of about 177 people identified as Melungeon descendants. The geneticist running the study at the time reported that the blood markers were consistent with populations from places like Portugal, Galicia and Spain, the Canary Islands, southern Italy, North Africa, Malta, Turkey, and Cyprus. For decades, this study became the scientific backbone of the Portuguese and Mediterranean origin theory. Melungeon advocate Brent Kennedy built much of his influential 1990s research and writing around these results, and it reignited pride and public interest in Melungeon heritage across the country. Documentaries were made, books were written, Melungeon heritage festivals started popping up in Tennessee. People who had spent generations hiding their ancestry suddenly had permission to celebrate it as something mysterious and exotic rather than something shameful. For the first time, being Melungeon felt like something you could stand up in public and claim, instead of something you had to quietly bury under a different explanation whenever anyone asked too many questions. But there was a problem, a big one. Genetic science in the late 1960s was incredibly primitive compared to what we have today. That original blood sample study relied on basic blood markers, not full DNA sequencing. And there were serious concerns about how those samples were even collected and handled decades earlier, including questions about contamination and the reliability of comparing broad population blood type frequencies to determine specific ancestry. In other words, the foundation that an entire modern identity movement was built on was scientifically shaky at best, resting on decades-old blood samples handled with methods that wouldn't hold up to modern laboratory standards at all. So starting in 2005, a group of dedicated researchers, including genetic genealogist Roberta Estes, Hawkins County archivist and longtime Melungeon researcher Jack Goins, along with Penny Ferguson and Janet Lewis Crane, launched something far more rigorous. They started what became known as the Melungeon Core DNA Project. This time, they weren't relying on 1960s blood typing. They were using modern Y chromosome DNA testing, which traces a person's direct paternal line, father to son, all the way back through history, and mitochondrial DNA testing, which traces the direct maternal line, mother to daughter to daughter. To be included in this study, participants had to prove documented Melungeon ancestry through careful genealogical research, tracing their family trees back to what researchers call the core Melungeon families, names like Collins, Gibson, Goins, Bunch, and several others that appear again and again in historical Melungeon records in Hancock County, Tennessee, and the surrounding region. Every single participant had to bring paper trails, old census records, church registries, and land documents just to prove they belonged in the study at all, which made the eventual results even harder to dismiss. And in 2011 and 2012, they published their findings in the Journal of Genealogy under the title Melungeons, a Multi-Ethnic Population. And the results shattered almost every legend that had been passed down for 200 years. Here's what they actually found. On the paternal side, tracing the Y chromosome DNA passed from father to son, the majority of the men tested carried either Western European or Sub-Saharan African paternal haplogroups. Not Portuguese, not Turkish, not Mediterranean. European and African, the two groups that, under the racial laws of colonial and early American Virginia, were absolutely forbidden from mixing. On the maternal side, the mitochondrial DNA testing showed that the direct female lines tested were of European origin, though researchers noted this side of the sample was smaller, and some Melungeon maternal lines elsewhere are understood to trace to women of color as well. Out of all the family lines studied, only one line, the Sizemore line, could be clearly traced back to Native American paternal ancestry, which is fascinating on its own because Native American heritage was actually one of the most commonly claimed origin stories among Melungeon families for generations, right alongside the Portuguese story. And yet, according to this genetic evidence, true Native American paternal ancestry turned out to be far rarer among the core Melungeon lines than almost anyone expected, which alone was enough to shake families who had built entire personal identities around a Cherokee or Powhatan great-grandmother who, genetically speaking, may never have existed the way the family stories claimed. So what does this actually mean? The researchers concluded that the most likely origin of the Melungeon people traces back to unions between African men, likely free or indentured, and European women in colonial Virginia sometime in the mid-1600s. This was before slavery in America had fully hardened into the brutal, codified, race-based system it would later become. In that earlier window of time, class lines were still messier than race lines. Indentured servants of different backgrounds worked side by side, lived side by side, and yes, sometimes had relationships and started families together regardless of skin color. There was a strange, narrow moment in early colonial Virginia where poverty and servitude mattered more than skin color when it came to who you could marry or live beside, and it's inside that narrow window that the Melungeon story appears to begin. But as the decades rolled forward and Virginia and the surrounding colonies began passing increasingly strict anti-miscegenation laws specifically designed to criminalize relationships and marriages between white people and people of African or partial African descent, these mixed families found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't openly acknowledge their ancestry anymore. It had become dangerous, even criminal, to admit it. So according to the researchers, these families began moving together as groups, migrating from Virginia down through the Carolinas and eventually settling deep in the remote mountains of East Tennessee, in places like Hancock County, where the terrain was rugged enough and the population sparse enough that they could live largely undisturbed, marrying mostly within their own community for generations, and quietly building an entire hidden world in the hills, far away from the courts and lawmakers who would have destroyed them for existing. Which finally explains one of the oldest mysteries in the story. Why did English settlers arrive in these Appalachian valleys in the 1700s and find a population that was already there, already established, with cabins, families, and generations of history behind them? Because they weren't a lost tribe from ancient times, and they weren't the ghosts of some vanished European colony. They were the direct descendants of colonial-era African and European couples who had fled criminalization in Virginia decades earlier and quietly built new lives in the mountains, far from prying eyes and hostile courts. It's almost like watching a slow-motion escape play out across 100 years, one generation moving a little further into the hills than the last, each one putting more distance between themselves and the laws that would have torn their families apart. Now here's the part that hits hardest. Once this modern DNA research came out in 2011 and 2012, it made headlines across the country, and the reaction inside Melungeon descendant communities was intense. Some families were fascinated. Many were genuinely shaken. For generations, they had built their identities, their family pride, even their sense of exotic mystery around being Portuguese or Turkish or Native or Mediterranean. And now here was hard genetic evidence suggesting that the true root of it all was something their ancestors had spent 2 centuries desperately trying to hide, specifically because admitting it could have destroyed their lives. It wasn't shameful. It never should have been. But under the racial laws of the 1700s and 1800s, their ancestors were forced to believe it was, and forced to bury it so deep that the truth got lost for 200 years, even to their own descendants. Some people described feeling like the ground had shifted under them overnight, like a piece of their identity they'd never questioned had suddenly been rewritten by a laboratory report. Think about the sheer psychological weight of that. Imagine finding out, through a genetic test taken in the 21st century, that the family story you grew up hearing, the one your grandmother told you with such certainty about ancient Portuguese sailors or lost European colonists, was actually a survival strategy invented generations ago to protect your ancestors from persecution under laws that no longer even exist. That your real story is arguably even more remarkable. Not shipwrecked sailors, not a vanished colony, real people, an African man and a European woman, falling in love or building a life together in 1600s Virginia, in a narrow window of history before the laws slammed shut on people like them, and then their descendants fighting, hiding, and reinventing themselves for 2 centuries just to survive. And there's one more twist to this story that makes it even stranger. Even after the 2012 study came out, it didn't fully settle the debate, and honestly, it probably never will completely. The sample size, while carefully vetted for documented ancestry, was still relatively small in the world of population genetics. Some researchers and community members have pointed out that different Melungeon family lines may carry genuinely different ancestral origins, since Melungeon was never really one single bloodline. It was more like an umbrella term applied to several distinct multi-ethnic families who ended up living in overlapping communities and eventually blending together through intermarriage. So while the dominant genetic signal points toward that African-European, colonial Virginia origin, some individual family lines within the broader Melungeon world may still carry other admixtures. Some Native American heritage here, a trace of something else there, layered in over the following centuries as families connected with neighboring communities. Independent testing companies working outside the core academic study have even reported occasional matches to Middle Eastern, Southeastern European, and Romani reference populations in individual family results, which keeps the door open just enough for the old legends to survive in some corners of the family tree, even if they don't represent the dominant story. There's also a wilder detail that keeps popping up in modern retellings of this story, the claim that even famous American figures may share Melungeon ancestry somewhere back in their family tree, including names as big as Elvis Presley and Ava Gardner, both of whom trace roots back to Appalachian and Southern family lines that some researchers connect to Melungeon heritage. Whether every one of these celebrity connections holds up to strict genealogical scrutiny is debated, but the fact that this hidden Appalachian bloodline may run through some of the most iconic names in American pop culture history says a lot about just how deeply and quietly Melungeon ancestry spread across the country as families left the mountains over the last century looking for work, opportunity, and a fresh start away from the label that had followed them for generations. Picture that for a second, a global icon like Elvis Presley, possibly carrying the exact same hidden bloodline that Martha Simmerman was fighting to disguise in a courtroom back in 1874. And that's really the final piece of this whole story. For most of American history, being Melungeon meant living in the space between categories, not fully accepted as white, not classified as black, sometimes labeled in court and census records as free persons of color, sometimes recorded completely differently by the next census taker who came through 10 years later. That inconsistency wasn't an accident. It reflects just how uncomfortable American racial categories have always been with people who don't fit neatly into a single box. The Melungeons didn't choose to exist in that uncomfortable in-between space. They were forced into it by laws that demanded a strict racial binary in a world that, biologically and historically, was never actually that simple. One census taker might write white, the next one, 10 years later, in the same county, looking at the same family, might write mulatto or free-colored. The family itself hadn't changed. The paperwork had, depending entirely on who was holding the pen that year. Today, the story is finally being told differently. Instead of shame, there's a growing movement among Melungeon descendants to reclaim the identity with pride rather than secrecy. Genealogy groups, DNA projects, and community organizations now openly research and celebrate this mixed heritage, not as a mystery to be embarrassed about, but as a genuinely unique piece of early American history. A story about African and European colonists forming families in the 1600s, being pushed to the edges of society by racist laws, adapting, migrating, surviving in some of the most rugged terrain in the country, and inventing whatever story they needed to in order to protect their children for the next 200 years. There are online communities now where descendants trade research tips, compare DNA matches, share old family photographs, and slowly piece together which of the old legends actually connects to real history and which ones were simply protective fiction passed down with love. So when you go back to that Tennessee courtroom in 1874, with Martha Simmerman sitting there, her entire future depending on a story about ancient Phoenicians and Portuguese sailors, you're not just looking at one woman's legal battle. You're looking at the entire Melungeon story compressed into a single moment, a community that had to lie to survive, that built an identity out of necessity rather than truth, and that carried that necessary lie so far and for so long that even they eventually forgot where the truth actually ended and the survival story began. It took modern DNA science, more than 2 centuries later, to finally pull that thread all the way back and reveal what was really hiding underneath. Not a lost colony, not shipwrecked nobility, just people. People who loved to cross lines they weren't supposed to cross, in a narrow window of American history before the laws closed in, and whose descendants spent the next 200 years quietly, desperately, making sure nobody ever found out. And now everybody knows. The truth finally caught up with the legend, and honestly, the real story turned out to be far more powerful than any myth they ever told to protect themselves. What started as a courtroom lie in 1874 to save one woman's inheritance turned out to be the key that, generations later, unlocked one of the most overlooked chapters of American history. A story of love, fear, survival, and identity hidden in plain sight in the hills of Appalachia the entire time.